Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us for another one of our comparative economics webinar. We are delighted to have Professor Enrico Spolaore today. Before talking about what future for the European Union, before briefly introducing Enrico, I would like to go over again the house rules, just to point out that if you have any questions during his presentation, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen, and we'll stop every 15 or 20 minutes during his presentation to try to collect and synthesize the questions that have been raised. And after his presentation, we will just raise your hand and we will unmute you, and you can ask your question during the Q&A session. Let me just welcome Professor Enrico Spolaore today. It's a huge pleasure to have you. Enrico is working so much on this on European integration. He's currently Seth Marion Chair and Professor of Economics at Tufts University. And it's an absolute delight to have you here. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And Enrico, I mean, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Naur and Michael. This is a great opportunity. I'm very grateful. I'm also very sad, of course, too, because this is just a few days after Alberto Alesina, who was my mentor, co-author, very close friend, passed just a few miles from here, from where I'm talking. And Alberto was here at this webinar just 2 weeks ago when Davide Fuceri presented their joint work. And one of the very last messages that, in fact, if I may, I would like to dedicate this seminar to his memory, to his honor. And just a few days ago, one of the last messages that he has sent is. Ricordami del tuo seminario un paio di giorni prima che ci voglio essere, that I want to be there, that I should remind him to be here, so that he wanted to be here. So it's especially sad for me to know that he expected to be here. At the same time, I think it's fitting that the topic of this seminar is Europe and is the future for Europe, because it was very much at the center of his work. One of the things that he really cared about. He was, very deeply Italian and very deeply European as well, even though he lived and worked in the United States, and he cared a lot about Italy and Europe, a little bit with that kind of love-hate that many of us have, especially living abroad. Love for Italy, love for Europe, and a little bit of hate for not, for wasting the potential, for not having all the creativity, the energy that we could have in Italy, in Europe, all the things that one could do. Block about all sorts of constraints, bureaucracies, and bad policies, inefficient policies. Also, we have to remember that he really has changed the way that we are thinking about economics by joining economics with political variables and more recently with cultural variables. And one of the very first things that he wrote in one of his first contributions was the social planner doesn't exist. So we don't have efficient policies by default. We have to struggle for them, and we know that that we need to really deeply understand how the incentives of politicians and voters interact with each other, and also more important, where do values and beliefs come from, and how do they change over time? They are not set in stone. So these are all themes I think that he was very interested, and they are all very relevant to understand Europe. So when I started working with him, we were working on the number and size of nations, which in fact here is the cover of a book that we wrote together on the size of nations that contains research that we had been doing over the years. Europe is a big theme in this book. In fact, there is a whole chapter about Europe. And more important, I think the whole intellectual framework, the whole analytical framework on how to think about political integration, about European integration, and how that interacts with how nation states act is is discussed in this book. So what I'm going to discuss today is very much rooted in this approach, in this political economy approach to the formation of political unions and jurisdictions. So now moving to more directly what I'm going to discuss, it will be based mostly on some work that I have done a few years ago on try to explain to economists what is European integration is really about, when of course it's mostly a political project, and many of its characteristics that again look extremely inefficient and missing also. There are a lot of missing pieces. It's a big theme will be of this discussion is the incompleteness, the fact that why so many things are missing in Europe is something that we have to understand the history and the political economy of it. And also there is a chapter in the Handbook of the Economics of European Integration that might be relevant. But of course, today I really would like to talk mostly about how also the current crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic is changing the European Union. Now, because we are seeing something that I personally see as encouraging signs. You know, just today, Ursula von der Leyen has presented the recovery plan. Now it's called Next Generation EU, which seems quite ambitious given the political realities of Europe. So we will discuss that and how that fits, but how that fits into the bigger picture, which also was something that Alberto would have really cared a lot about, always fitting what is going on right now in the bigger picture and try to understand it in a possibly simple way. So try to make it simpler, although these are complicated issues, try to find what is at the core. And using both analytical tools, maybe I will present a simple model, a very simple model that I wrote specifically to try to understand these particular issues about European integration, and also using history, or using a little bit the historical experience, both the past history of the European Union, but also the history, what we have learned in the previous crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, which I think is very relevant to understand what might be happening right now, because of course we have questions about the COVID crisis, which are questions, it could really go either way in principle, like in many crises that Europe has faced. It's possible that the economic, the political shocks of the pandemic might increase tensions. We already see some of that. Clearly there is a tension, conflicts of interest, different preferences over what it should be done, and there could be therefore centrifugal forces at work. It's also possible, and this is something that many also are expecting, I think now, especially given the history of Europe, that this could be an opportunity, that this could be a way to move really to the next level and to have a more institutional integration. So this could be Monnet's vindication. Jean Monnet was one of the fathers of Europe. He was the first head of the Coal and Steel Commission, and then of course very, very important for the Treaty of Rome. And he wrote in his memoir that Europe will be made in crisis and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for this crisis. And in many ways, this I believe as being partly true, and in fact probably even very true maybe, but also a little bit problematic, because the faith that crisis can necessarily lead to the next step is also be a problem, especially in the past 10, 20 years, when Europe has moved to those areas of integration that are much harder to integrate, where there are higher, as we will see, as we will discuss, political heterogeneity costs. So the central problem of European institutional architecture is incompleteness, is the fact that so many things are missing that typically you would expect when you provide a set of public goods. The Europe has achieved greatly. I should say right away, and so that it is full disclosure, I'm a big fan of European integration. I believe that European integration should move forward. I'm not certainly a skeptic in general of Europe. When I saw Nauro the last time physically in person a few years ago, was right a few months before the Brexit vote. And we had, in fact, I think a couple of events, one in London and one at the Royal Economic Society, where there was a panel at the Royal Economic Society where I was kindly invited, and we were discussing Brexit. And of course, like all the economists in the room, I think there were 900 economists, I think everybody thought that Brexit was not a good idea economically, and probably most of them also politically. And I was telling Britain, I mean, many of us were telling Britain it would be a mistake. Britain already had the best of possible worlds, even though, of course, we understood the politics and we understood the high heterogeneity cost that many people perceived of being part of something for which they didn't feel very close culturally or linguistically or politically. So these kind of issues are certainly very central. The single market was, so as I said, I'm a fan of Europe. I think that Europe has achieved great things, and the single market and the common currency, I think, are very good things overall. I don't believe that the euro was necessarily a mistake. It was done in this way, in this incomplete way, for the reasons that we will discuss, which of course created a lot of problems. But per se, I think it would be terrible now for my country, Italy, and for many other countries in Europe to have the lira or to have our currency in the middle of the pandemic. Imagine in what situation we would be. So the fact of having the euro, the fact of having a single market, the fact of having integration has been great also economically. Nauro has done a lot of work with these quotas, many of them Italians, about how much countries have benefited economically in terms of productivity, in terms of GDP per capita by being in the single market. So single market common currency are great, but there are many things missing. There is no insurance union. There is no insurance, which now we will see right away. There is no common unemployment insurance. Everybody knows there is no fiscal union. There is no fiscal policy in the union. There is clearly no political union. So now we can argue to what extent integration should go, and we could have different debate about to what extent this really should be a political union. But clearly we cannot be in this sort of half-built house, as many people have been talking. And the response to the sovereign debt crisis of the 2010s, I think, was overall disappointing. There were only a few reforms that were made. Even the banking union is very imperfect, and still there is not still common credit depositing insurance. We do have the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, that now is likely to play a very important role, especially as being reinterpreted. There is the outright monetary transaction, quantitative easing, and so on. But overall, the response, I think, was very partial and very incomplete. And the response to the economic fallout of the pandemic seems to be more ambitious, but it's very controversial, and we don't know how it's going to end up. And there's been this attempt to fix this incompleteness. There is the SURE, to the unemployment risk, the commission level. There is the ESM, which is already mentioned, which is a separate agency. And there is the EU recovery plan, which I think politically is extremely interesting because it shows a complete transformation of the attitude of Germany towards Europe. And here I believe that Angela Merkel is showing true leadership. And I will discuss some of the questions that of course, this raises politically. But now I could see that this is just today, Ursula von der Leyen has revealed some numbers. At least this is the plan. Of course, we don't know if this is going to be implemented. And we are talking about the net contribution. If I have the numbers right, just look at the net contribution of Germany just for this next generation EU plan would be 103 billion euro, 131 from Germany, 21 back to Germany. So this is very significant. Well, of course, Italy would be a net beneficiary. Not by the 81 billions that are discussed, but given that also contribute 56 by 26, which is 1.5% of GDP. These are not enormous numbers given the size of the crisis, but politically and institutionally, this is a complete change of the game because it would introduce fiscal policy potential. Of course, the fact that the Commission will be able to borrow and have, Euro bonds and so on. This changes the nature of institutions in Europe. So people are being asked, are we living this Hamilton moment, this Alexander Hamilton moment, the same way that in the 18th century, Hamilton, by creating federal debt and fiscal policy in the US, was really turning the US into a federation. much more than just a confederation. And that's what the German finance minister Scholz suggested. But of course, others are very skeptical, and people said that, you know, that the Finnish prime minister is a little too much on the based on the play Hamilton in Broadway rather than on the reality. So these are the questions. And so the European Union as a half-built house is very much being part of the rhetoric of the almost a cliche in Europe, and this was also in the report of the 5 presidents. It should be completely moving towards a financial union, through a fiscal union, which is what we were discussing right away, through a political union. But the question is, why is Europe a half-built house, and what future for the half-built house? So what I would like to do is to briefly mention the historical origins of the half-built house, why we have this incompleteness, which is based on a dynamic view of Europe as a chain reaction toward an ever closer union, in which you would do one public good or one function at the time. And the fact that these functions would be only incomplete and imperfect in a way could be a way to spur, to incentivize further integration, because then you will need the next pieces, and you especially need them in the middle of the crisis. Now, has this strategy worked and will continue to work? Now, I can already anticipate that I believe that Jean Monnet had a brilliant idea, and it has been successful for a long time, especially at the beginning with commercial integration, with the single market and so on. But there are intrinsic problems with this gradualist, functionalist view, and those were the problems that we face in the recent crisis, in the one before this, the sovereign debt crisis, and therefore I hope that now the approach will be different, will be more systematic, and will point more and also more ambitious. So the fundamental trade-off that is discussed in the book that I mentioned with Alberto, which is at the center of this literature, is between the high economies of scale from integration in Europe, but also high heterogeneity costs that mostly are political and cultural and come from different preferences over public goods and policies. Now, there is, of course, a lot of heterogeneity economically. These are different regions with different GDP per capita. And of course, there is a lot of even difference within European countries, but there is a lot of heterogeneity and economic differences across countries. Now, this heterogeneity probably is going to be even larger now that COVID has hit different regions very differently. And it's not particularly correlated, by the way, to income per capita. In Italy, certainly the hardest hit region is the richest one, while many European countries like Greece has done very well, fortunately, or Portugal. So there are clearly differences, that heterogeneity. So policies, the public policies of Europe will be perceived very differently from different countries or even regions within countries, and there will be a lot of potential conflict about this in the provision of these public goods. There is a lot of deeper linguistic and ethnic and cultural difference. Here is a map of different ancestral languages of Europe that my co-author Roman Wagzierk and I have used to build measures of linguistic distance and cultural distance across regions that can be used, and we are using now in empirical work to try to understand what's going on, not only historically with the diffusion of ideas and behaviors, but also politically right now. So the economies of scale are easy to quantify. The heterogeneity is harder to define and measure, but there is a lot of empirical literature that this matters. But it doesn't mean necessarily that heterogeneity has only cost. It has also benefits. It's good to be sometimes diverse, to be heterogeneous, but it depends very much on what we are considering. In the case of public goods, typically it's costly to have different preferences, because we have to share non-rival goods that have to share by many within a jurisdiction which have different preferences over this public good. Well, when we talk about rival goods, the fact of having heterogeneous preferences might be a good thing, while having the same preferences might be bad, because everybody wants the same rival good. Well, so when we talk about the empirical evidence of the heterogeneity and conflict, we see that conflict over public goods is very high among more different population, and we have a lot of evidence about the effects of ethno-linguistic polarization or linguistic cleavage, including some work by Roman Wagzierk and co-authors. And while the work that I did with Roman myself focus on conflict over rival goods, then showing that in that case heterogeneity is in fact good, while it's a similarity that is bad. So in general, but that's going back to the European dilemma. I think we can reformulate a little bit with a twist to say there are high economies of scale, there are high benefits from diversity, especially with interacting over rival goods, which is also a reason why the single market has been such a big success, because obviously gains from trade very often come from diversity. But there is this high heterogeneity cost from different preferences over public goods and policies. So if we look at the box here where we are really in this box where there are high heterogeneity cost and high economies of scale. And therefore, it's not easy to know at what level these goods should be provided. Obviously, if you have low heterogeneity cost and high economies of scale, you should do it at the European level. That's why commercial integration has been such a big success. If you have high heterogeneity cost and low economies of scale, you should stay local. But what about the common currency, the common fiscal policy, defense, full political union? Should we do it at the larger level? Now, the way that Europe dealt with it, especially starting with the issues about defense, about reducing conflict, avoiding the wars of the beginning of the 20th century, was to go first for coal and steel, and that worked very well. And this was the Schuman Declaration of 1950. But then many people might not know that there was a defense community set up that had been already agreed by all the 6 original states and was just blocked by the French Parliament. The Gaullists and the communists were the one who voted against it. And that was a huge disappointment, because the defense community of the early 1950s would have been also a political union in many ways, because there would have been a political community, there would have been a parliament, there would be some democratic control in principle, at least over it. So what Monnet did was, okay, we have to go through partial integration in narrowly defined areas, such as coal and steel. That is feasible. While more ambitious integration is not politically feasible. So let's start from areas which now I would say have lower heterogeneity cost and where there are higher benefits. But then, but also he thought areas that are technical, where the voters, because he was very aware and concerned about the fact that the voters and politicians who reflected the preferences of many voters would be being reluctant to move towards the next steps. So that's how the Treaty of Rome came in this dynamic way, a foundation towards an ever closer union. Now the mechanisms that were discussed were endogenous cultural change would have been a positive mechanism. The idea that with partial integration will lead to cultural and political convergence within Europe. That as Europeans work more with each other, they will be more similar in preferences over public goods, over even identity. But this hasn't really happened. There's work by Alberto with Tabellini and Trebi, very recent, that shows that there hasn't been much cultural convergence in Europe when you measure these things through value survey responses and so on. But there's a darker mechanism that was at place that is that further integration would become necessary because of the pressure from the same inefficiencies and crises which are associated with incomplete integration. And this is the incompleteness and crisis mechanism of the Monnet chain reaction, which I discussed in those contributions that I mentioned. And this is very explicitly in Monnet own thinking. And it's Ball, who was a diplomat, an American diplomat who worked with Monnet, wrote, Monnet recognized the very rationality of this scheme that providing the coal and steel separate from other aspects of policy. But this irrationality would provide the pressure to achieve exactly what he wanted, the triggering of a chain reaction, the awkwardness and complexity resulting from the singling out of coal and steel would drive members to move towards further integration. And the economic and monetary union is considered a chain reaction. Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa was working was instrumental in creating the European and Monetary Union, talk about the road towards single currency looks like a chain reaction, which each step resolve a persisting contradiction and generate a new one that in turn require first step forwards. And so we move all the way to the euro, but it was an absurd, incomplete union, as Helmut Kohl said in 1991. It's absurd to expect in the long run you can maintain economic and monetary union without political union. So the euro lacked all sorts of institutions associated with successful monetary union, even some very basic stuff like a banking union or at the beginning, before quantitative easing and so on, before that whatever it takes, was even much more incomplete. Even as a European Central Bank, this was being widely discussed by economists. And on top of that, of course, is something which was obviously not an optimum currency area. But this was all rationalized as a feature of this partial integration as a chain reaction in this Monet tradition. So the problem with this is that as you enter into areas with higher heterogeneity cost, even if there are the high economies of scale, but the heterogeneity costs become higher and higher, what you have, and you're doing this gradual way, trying to sidestep the voters. Now, why would the voters agree to something like this? I mean, is that because they couldn't do dynamic programming? I mean, partly maybe, but there are reasonable ways one can rationalize how even a rational voter might decide to enter into this if the chance the crisis happened only with some probability and later on and with some discounting. But you can imagine how you could be trapped in a situation where you agree to partial integration, then there is a shock because the goods are incomplete. You end up that either you go towards completion, but of course then you have to bear a very high heterogeneity cost, or you have to accept even maybe possible breakup, or pay the cost of the inefficiency. And this was especially salient during the sovereign debt crisis, which led to a lot of unpopularity of the European project and even partial disintegration in the case of Brexit. Of course, Britain itself was not part of the euro, was not directly affected by the sovereign debt crisis, but of course there were many other things associated with it. There was an immigration crisis going along with it, and other aspects where the incompleteness of Europe was very problematic. Plus, Britain was very concerned that the next steps would be, I mean, many people in Britain at least would be this sort of functionalist move towards more of a federation or fiscal policy. So these all issues were very important also in dealing with Brexit. And we have a lot of evidence that there is being a big drop in trust for European institutions, going from the early 90s all the way. There's been a little bit of a recovery now after the financial crisis in the past 2-3 years. So there's been a little bit of a return of trust, but overall, Europeans trust the European institutions much less. And this drop is especially significant at the periphery. Greece and the UK, of course, saw a big drop. Greeks used to trust Europe a lot, and for obvious reasons, this has completely collapsed in the past few years. But overall, in all the European nations, you see a drop in trust. There is being also a very interesting change in the way that the core and the periphery have moved. In Germany, there has been an increase in trust, which might bode well for the fact that now maybe Germans, also through the leadership maybe of Angela Merkel, will be convinced to take actions that would be, maybe they would have been much more reluctant to take a few years ago. But in Italy, there has been a big collapse in trust. And this has also been true across different regions. If you look at different regions of Europe, you can see that after the crisis, trust, this is for the European Parliament even, which has usually been more trusted than other institutions in Europe. There's been a shift to the left, which means less trust. And then there's going to be, of course, a lot of voting for more extremist parties, both of the left or the right, or populists, especially of the right more recently. And you have, I would argue this is part of a consequence of the failure of the chain reaction. I don't have the time to go into the details of the dynamic model, and I can make these slides available to anybody interested. I'll write it down, the model, in a note soon enough. But I will just give you the gist of what I think a model that can capture this. So if you only have two public goods, A and B, this is very much inspired by the size of nations framework that with Alberto. So you have only two public goods, A and B, and so you could have no integration, so the A and B are not shared, and each country provides both. You could have partial integration where you share A but not B, or full integration where you share both. And here, the main point, the way that this model is designed, which is something that was not discussed in the size of nations, but it's very relevant for Europe, is that with partial integration, although in the size of nation we did discuss economies of scope more generally, With partial integration, you give up a lot of the economies of scope in providing two public goods together. So there are a lot of complementarities, let's say, as we already discussed, between having a monetary union, but also having an insurance union or having a fiscal union. So that if you only have one provided at the global, at the federal level, but not the other, you have a lot of cost, additional cost, especially when you have a crisis. So this theta changes depending on the situation. And in a crisis, this theta, which is the cost, the additional cost of partial integration, happens the crisis. The cost, the total cost of providing public goods, KA plus KB, capture the economies of scale. Because these economies of scale, I should say, come really from two sources in general. One is because they are associated to provision of public goods. So the more important governments are, the bigger are these economies of scale, which is very important when we'll discuss the COVID soon enough, because as I will argue, when the pandemic, there will be a bigger role for governments, and therefore the economies of scale will become more important, or already becoming more important, I should say, we're already in the middle of this. And the other aspects of the economies of scale, which is not as explicit in this particular very simplified model, but could be easily added to this, as it was done in the book, is that you have economies of scale from your domestic size, from your domestic market, where there are a lot of barriers to trade with the rest of the world. So these are, but the economies of scale are at the maximum when you have federal integration, and at the minimum when you have no integration. When you have this partial integration, you gain a little bit of economies of scale, but you also, because of different sizes, you have also this potential additional cost. The heterogeneity costs come from the fact that countries, people in different countries have different views about how these public goods should be provided and what type of public good you should provide. And the heterogeneity costs are maximum when you have a complete integration, and then they are intermediate in the case of partial integration. And they depend on the position of median voters with respect to these different public goods. And in terms of the political dynamics, if you think that, let's take the simplest possible way, you have non-overlapping generation of voters. If a majority of voters prefers full to partial, so it's full to no integration and full to partial, the system moves right away to F. But if a majority of voters only prefer P, first you move to P, to partial integration, and only later to F. You need voters. You need voters to agree. You always need all voters to agree, and which will be also important when we talk about whether the current process of moving towards more fiscal union will be approved by all the countries in Europe. But there is a difference between agreeing to something because you really like it and you would have agreed to it right away, and agree to it because it's very costly to move away from it. So a very important aspect in the dynamic aspect, there are adjustment costs. There's a breakup cost. So that if you add a cost C to the adjustment, so that once you have the euro, if you break up the euro, there will be a very large cost from breaking up the euro. Then you might have a situation like a marriage where people are just there because it would be very costly to divorce, but if they had chosen whether to marry or not, they would not have liked to marry in the first place. So that's what I would call an unpopular partial integration or unpopular full integration, where people would move away if they didn't have to pay the adjustment cost. And I want to go, in the case of 3 countries, which is a simple case, I want to move straight to the dynamics, which is, we can look at the optimistic mechanism where there is cultural convergence, where the heterogeneity costs are reduced. Then partial integration moves to full integration very nicely and very gradually. But there is a darker mechanism, the effects of crisis, when what happens is a shock to theta, the cost of having different public goods. One, let's say the monetary union offer at the global, at the federal level, but the fiscal policies or insurance offer at provided only at the local level. Then we really have we really have different dynamics depending on the heterogeneity cost, especially the heterogeneity cost faced by the countries at the periphery, the countries that are farther from the median voter. So this, in this graph, if we start from, even if we start from popular partial integration that was agreed by people, this is the heterogeneity cost in the vertical axis, the heterogeneity cost of moving towards fuller integration. And this theta is the cost that comes from having incompleteness, the cost of having the half-built house. Then we will have that if the heterogeneity costs are reduced endogenously because of cultural convergence, because of the fact that Europeans agree more and more, it would be straightforward to see that we move to popular full integration without any problems. So clearly this is a mechanism that can only lead to more efficient and better outcome. But the situation where Europe has been for most of the past decades has been this, where we might have started with popular partial integration, but at different levels of heterogeneity, the dynamics is very different. If we start at a low level of heterogeneity, then a shock that changes theta would move you from popular partial integration to popular full integration. This would be the ideal situation that Monet probably had in mind. The shock leads you to believe, oh, now I really have to do it. I really have to integrate more. But if we have higher levels of heterogeneity cost, a shock to popular partial integration would move you to unpopular partial integration to start with. So Europe might become less popular just because of the shock, as it has happened during the financial crisis. And maybe you can integrate a little bit more and add a few additional public goods to get out of there because you need it. But this will be unpopular full integration and therefore very unstable because, and of course, it would also change the political dynamics within Europe. And of course, a very high level of heterogeneity cost, like in the case of Britain, it could even lead to breakup. So what do we learn from this theory is, I'm going to skip a lot of this as I want to move to the discussion of the COVID, is, of course, it's not that we should have even higher adjustment costs and make the euro even more irreversible, which was a lesson that many people thought that that they came from this story. Let's make things extremely difficult to get out so that we can move forward, because this would be, besides being extremely inefficient, would also be politically very dangerous. And there's only a maximum amount of integration of adjustment cost that would really give you efficiency, which is very important efficiency here, because efficiency, the fact that you would have an efficient unit would allow, at least in principle, through side payments to compensate some of these groups that are that suffer more because of heterogeneity cost. Heterogeneity, which might be cultural, might also be economic, might be due to different shocks, and allow, therefore, to get the whole benefits of the union. And of course, the side payments now have become extremely important because of the COVID crisis, and we can see that in many ways the core, Germany, which has greatly benefited because of Europe, including because of the euro, now might be, especially if Germans perceive that Europe is very important to them, the single market has become even more important. I'm anticipating some of the topics that the next slides. If this is the case, they might be willing to have side payments that will allow to maintain an efficient union. But for this to work, of course, the size of the pie has to be such that there is room for having these side payments and still having the Germans better off and the rest of Europe is better off. So it's possible when there are symmetric costs that we could have a multi-speed Europe where some subsets of countries would decide to integrate further, but others who face higher heterogeneity cost might want to opt out, as Britain did originally with the euro, or Sweden, or in the case of the euro, of the currency. And so this will be a very important issues. Now, my own view, I can already anticipate, is that flexibility and possibility of opt-out might be extremely important for the political feasibility of the next steps. So the general lessons that we get from both the history and the theory, that the chain reaction approach using this incomplete and inefficient arrangements cannot go all the way when there are high heterogeneity costs. It can work for a while when what is integrated is reasonably, it's facing the trade-off between heterogeneity and economies of scale at a reasonably low level. But at higher levels of heterogeneity compared to the economies of scale, the chain reaction would work in reverse. And this is what we have learned from the sovereign debt crisis of 2010. So what is going to happen now? Is this time different? And here, very often, people who discuss the pandemic tend to just take whatever arguments they were making before the pandemic and say, now more than ever. That's what Larry Summers said recently in one of these talks. He's also making fun of himself that he was saying, oh, the stagnation is going to be even more important, the secular stagnation, now more than ever. I'm not going to use I'm not going to do this here because I believe that now the COVID-19 crisis is really sui generis, is really different, and it is creating conditions where now we might be in a very different situations, so that now this crisis might really be a vindication of money. It might really lead to more integration in Europe. This time might really be different as a result of the crisis. But why is that so? Because things have been changing the fundamental parameters of the model that I discussed. There is a much bigger role for governments and public policy. So there's a big increase in K, my model K, the cost of the public goods and the importance of the public goods, the economies of scaling public good provision, at least temporary, but possibly for a long way to go. And there might be increasing benefits from having a larger European market. This we don't know, but there is a lot of speculation that we might be moving more towards resilience and self-sufficiency, at least in the short term, over efficiency and globalization. So there's a shift from globalization to regionalism. This would make the European single market much more important for Germany. We would not be able to trade as much with China, with the rest of the world. We don't know if this is going to happen. This is very much a question. In fact, if this is going to happen, this will strengthen the incentives for Europe, because to form, to stay cohesive. Because this is not necessarily a good thing, of course, because of course, like many economists would like to see a return to the benefits from globalization and from more broader multilateral exchanges. But very often there is hysteresis, so that barriers that are set maybe for medical reasons or because of the crisis might stay there for a long time to go. So in my model, this would be a big increase in the critical value of heterogeneity. So even the heterogeneity stays the same, the critical value of heterogeneity at which the dynamics takes place would change. So that you would have moves towards full integration, even popular full integration at much higher levels of heterogeneity. And so that would lead to a dynamic where you would see more European integration. Now, the role of Germany would be key for this, because we can see that very much will depend on the German median voter. Is the German median voter more willing to transfer resources, side payments to other European countries and strengthen the union? Or is it possible that Angela Merkel is acting against her voters' deeper preferences and beliefs, but taking advantage of the exceptional and temporary circumstances? Now, some surveys that I recently saw seem to point out that now these moves, even this next generation EU, even the plan with Macron of the 18th of May that is leading now to this ambitious European plan, is popular with the German voters at the moment. But of course, the German voters, the opposers cannot really organize because of the pandemic, because everybody's just on Zoom and there's no way to go on the streets or to talk with each other much in person. They cannot really, so an organized opposition to this in Germany might be only, might not be visible at the moment, but it might happen. So Germany will be crucial. There's also the issue of the German Constitutional Court decision of May 5th that some people had saw as a very big blow to European integration because it's questioning the role of the European Central Bank. But other people have seen paradoxically as a reason to move forward to the institutionalization of EU-wide fiscal integration and financial integration, so that it would become legal to do things that now have just been accepted as de facto, but really not de jure, and might be even against the current constitution of Germany. Now, of course, there are broader issues across all member states that will be central in these dynamics. That as we you can see, based on the history and political economy analysis that I very briefly sketched before. One aspect that I haven't mentioned much, but which is very important, is when we talk about preferences and beliefs, very much they're endogenous, and they very much depend what people, cultural aspects are not set in stone, and people might have very different views about what is appropriate or what is not appropriate, very often depending on framing, but based on their own underlying moral, fundamental moral values. But very much this depends on also how the story is framed, so that the sovereign debt was very much framed as a story of virtue versus vice, so that the Greeks were sinful for having, got into the situation that they got, and therefore they didn't deserve to be saved, and so on. Is the same story going to come up now with the COVID? We already see a little bit of that. Those that were hit harder by COVID, they did it because of their own inefficiency or inability, or while people who got hit less, it was due to some underlying characteristics, so that they don't deserve to be saved. Or will this be perceived really a truly exogenous shock that has hit different people different ways, also because of luck, or bad luck, or good luck, and therefore there is not much issue of a moral hazard in providing help. So this will be an essential point. But then, of course, conditional on that, how do we reach consensus about the way that Europe should proceed? And here, the past history shows that typically Europe moves toward some sort of watered down compromise eventually. There will be a watering down of the recovery plan. This would be what you would expect based on the past, but because this is a completely different situation, I would be surprised if we really go towards a complete watering down and in the typical way that Europe typically acts. It's more likely, I would expect, or at least maybe it's more of a hope, that maybe what will be learned is not to compromise and get everybody on board, but to be flexible and to allow some people maybe to opt out, because here you can do it, certainly, especially if you have the big four on board. If you have Germany, France, Italy, and Spain agreeing, you could have smaller countries opting out temporarily from some of these schemes, while moving forward with the bigger institutional changes. But of course, this could be problematic if you really want to have a change fundamentally at the core of the way that the European Union works, that the Commission works, that the institutions work. When you really have a fiscal policy, a budget at the European level. So the last thing that I want to say, because giving time for any questions or comments, is the final words from almost exactly today, was May 1950, the Schuman Declaration, which was the original, the starting point of the European integration. Europe will be built through concrete achievements, which create a de facto solidarity. Now, of course, solidarity very often is used, I understand, as just an excuse from some people to get transfers from others, and so that would be, in this context, this would be the incorrect interpretation, exactly because a lot of the benefits from solidarity here are really ex ante. Under a veil of ignorance, everybody could benefit from this kind of solidarity. Even 6 months from now, we don't know 6 months from now who will need help, who will be in a major recession, who will be hit again by, let's hope not, by second waves of the virus, or unexpected fallout, economic and political fallout. So in many ways, this solidarity, I believe, is becoming central, and the concrete achievements will be fundamental. So we really have to see if Europe really manages this crisis in a way that will lead to concrete achievements. I believe this would be the kind of sort of practical, common sense approach, which I think Alberto himself would have liked, because Alberto wrote about this. Alberto Alesina wrote about this recently with Giavazzi. Just I think a month or two ago, he had a piece on will the coronavirus kill the European Union, where he was making arguments that I believe are very much consistent with what I'm discussing. He was never a utopian, never had a utopian view of Europe as something that can become the United States of Europe very quickly. He always said he was a Jeffersonian rather than Hamiltonian in the debate when Europe was concerned. But he believed that this was the time that Europe had to be very ambitious with the European stability mechanism and with any kind of, he liked the fact that Europe was being ambitious on this dimension. So in that sense, I believe that, based on a very realistic and hard-nosed political economy analysis, we might hope that, this time will be different. But this is a big question mark with all the, the issues that I highlighted. So now I'll give, time for questions or comments.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Enrico, for a truly fascinating talk. I mean, we have a few questions that are quite general. Then we'll go first because of the Hamilton-Jefferson point you just made to Robert Bell.
I unmute you now.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yes. Sorry. Can you repeat the question? What was the? I think I missed. You asked a question.
Oh, no. He will ask himself the question now.
Oh. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh.
So we just unmuted him.
Oh, okay.
Robert.
Yes, I was very interested in the comparison to the Hamilton moment, and was just pointing out in my question that to win over Jefferson and get support from the South to have the federal government assume all debts in 1790, Hamilton had to offer a quid pro quo. He had to make a compromise. He had to agree to give up his dream of having New York City be the capital of the new United States and agree with Jefferson and Madison that it would be on the Potomac River in Virginia. And I'm just asking, if Macron is Hamilton and Merkel was the skeptical Jefferson, what did Macron have to give up? Or was he asked to make a quid pro quo to win Merkel's support for something she clearly was not inclined to do at first?
Yeah, that's a great question. My immediate response was the crown of Charlemagne would be the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor. Maybe he gave it to her because that when they first met in Aachen in 2019, they met inside the cathedral where Charlemagne is buried, and I suspected that. I mean, of course, this is I'm kind of joking, but I think there is a grain of seriousness here. One aspect that I think might be going on here is that for a long time Europe was really perceived as this France and Germany sort of partnership, but where France was politically the senior partner and Germany was the economic senior partner. But a lot of the original leadership in the for a long time came from France, and then of course Germany became way more prominent as a leader, but during the sovereign financial crisis, Angela Merkel did not really embrace this view of having major leadership in Germany. Of course, at the time also there was still Britain, I think, in the Union. So now those who have always argued that the European Union is an attempt to recreate the Holy Roman Empire and to create sort of an imperial sort of entity in Europe might see this prediction take place in a democratic way, of course. But what might really happen is therefore a lot of fundamental leadership going to Angela Merkel in this deal. Now, I don't know how much of this would really be institutionalized. I think this is more of a political equilibrium. I think a temporary political equilibrium. Clearly, a little bit of this also happened when Draghi and Merkel had a de facto agreement that Angela Merkel would support Draghi because she understood that politically she needed that for the whatever it takes. So in that sense, she already showed some leadership there in 2012. So in that, but there will not be. I mean, it would be the example of the moving the capital from New York to Washington is great in the terms of my framework, because you could spatially see how the media, the type of public good is moving closer to the south, exactly so that you reduce the heterogeneity cost, so that the side payments don't need to be as large, and you can have sort of the deal coming out of it. I don't think we will move the capital of the European Union, to Berlin, but it will be there will be a change in the role of Germany in Europe, I believe, in the next few years. It will be even more central. That's my expectation.
All right. We do have a couple of questions here. Let me, just for the sake of time, read them out for you and try to combine them. The first one is by Guillaume Payou, and he asks, you mentioned the possibility for the Frugal Four to opt out of a more intense integration deal. Is this with the assumption that there will be a successful pressure for those who opt out today to ultimately take part later on? And the other question, which is also quite broad, is in your view, would the EU disintegrate like the Soviet Union?
I mean, the second part, I would say no, because the EU is very different from the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union was really a colonial empire. So it disintegrated the way that the big colonial empires are disintegrated. I mean, it was really a centralized colonial empire. It lost a lot of its colonies. Russia is still there. They just lost a lot of the colonies and the groups that were, it was a Leviathan. It was a non-democratic Leviathan. Europe is, in spite of all the talk about the democratic deficit, there was a democratic deficit at the heart of Europe, because the voters did not have direct voice over what was discussed at the European level. But it's a democracy in the sense that it's a supranational organization of individual democracies, and it looks more like the Holy Roman Empire in the sense that was not holy and was not Roman, was not an empire, in the sense that it can always be in place as a supranational organization. So it would not disintegrate in the sense of the Soviet Union. Now it might lose its reason to survive. In that sense, it might disintegrate. Countries might, or that is, I believe, at this moment, extremely unlikely. It's going even much more unlikely that I would say, 1 or 2 years. In the longer run, it might change its nature in the sense it might shrink. Some countries might leave at some point. Although I don't see that as an immediate threat to the Union. But I suspect that there is a risk of overshooting. There is the risk of the European Union becoming, moving too fast towards very strong political and fiscal integration, and then later creating tensions because of that inside, so that some countries might feel that they really want to break it up. But overall, I believe, my prediction would be that 50 years from now, it will still be here. I mean, let's see if I'm right or wrong. Sorry, there was also another question besides this. Can you repeat it?
Yes. Nora, do you want?
Whether the Frugal Four would, yes, about the Frugal Four, whether eventually they will have to join. So, well, it depends. I mean, there are two aspects to the current plan. There is an aspect which is about the negotiation of transfers of money. And that is the easiest thing. This is thing that economists understand very well. There is a lot of room for some efficient bargaining in principle. Of course, because of politics, it might not happen. But the fact, at the margin, one can decide, okay, you can opt out in the sense that you don't, even though given your GDP and your size, you should provide this much to these common funds, you can provide less. We can give you, the way that, Mrs. Thatcher had negotiated deals like that, which is a way to say, we recognize that for political reason or even cultural reasons, you don't agree with us on this particular move. So that can be done. But of course, if you have to change the institutional structure of the Europe, and many people fear that, people that are more Eurosceptic fear that you can say, now you are telling me this is a temporary thing, but once you establish a budget, now we are talking about sums that are maybe 1% of GDP of a country. Italy would get a transfer that's maybe 1 or 1.5% of the GDP. But what ensures me that later Italy or Greece or Spain or whatever will get 10% of GDP transfer from European Commission budget and so on. What guarantees me that eventually? So this will be a little bit harder to compromise about, and so that is where things can get blocked. And so maybe even for good reasons, because of course we also don't want to create one more huge bureaucracy with a huge budget with its own taxes that ends up overtaxing Europeans. We don't want to move in that direction. Now, of course, sometimes institutions are set up in order to provide side payments. So, for example, the common agricultural policy. This is the kind of stuff that we might see. So the common agricultural policy of the 1960s was one of the most inefficient things that everybody complained about. But many people have rationalized it in terms of political economy as a way for the Germans to compensate the French for the fact that they were opening up their market. The French have always been very protectionist. They always had very high barriers to trade even, but they were saying, okay, we accept that we will be part of a common market with Germany, but we want some compensation. And the compensation was these transfers motivated through agriculture, through the common agricultural policy. So now that is a possible compromise. So maybe one could invent some specific institutional twist that might allow to keep into the game some countries that otherwise would oppose it. And so we might see something like that. I think this will be a time, I think, for many political economists to be creative and suggest. The most important thing, though, that is really the main message of this whole talk, let's not do it in an incomplete, half-built way, because not as a chain reaction. No, let's do these steps, and later we know that they are inefficient, there are a lot of holes, and later, in the next crisis, we will fix what is left. No, we have to do it in a way that makes sense systematically, that doesn't have holes, that doesn't have, so when the next crisis comes, all the tools are there. And they are also political, it's a political equilibrium. And the voters are overall happy. That's the other thing, and they're convinced. Because leadership is really convincing the voters that that's also in their interest. So the voters have to be on board, most voters in most countries. And so that will be the real challenge. It has to be done democratically this time, not try to, cheat the voters, and it has to be done systematically and in a way that makes both economic sense and political sense. So that's I think what we'll have to work with, and also those who are based in Europe, but also those who are not based in Europe, help the Europeans, their governments, and the European Commission to come up with solutions that are long-lasting and efficient.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Enrico. We have one last question by Professor Daniel Borkovich. We'll try to unmute you now, Dan.
You still mute, I think. Oh, okay, now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, Daniel, we hear you.
Yeah, this came up early in the talk, but I'd just like you to be more explicit about it because it's all over in the model, which is that I'd like you to really clarify sort of what are there these scale economies and even scope economies from uniform testing procedures and contact tracing, declining unit costs, and how much do they bump up against the heterogeneous preferences for privacy? We see a lot of that in the United States, right? And for kind of doing it my way and individualism versus social cooperations. Can you really put some numbers on that or some empirics to that?
That's a fascinating question because just by looking at what's happening, there's a lot of heterogeneity within the United States in references to policy. There's been a lot of heterogeneity within Italy. Some people might not be aware of that, but even the regions that were ruled by the same majorities next one to the other, Lombardy and Veneto, they had very different outcomes and very different policies, and also very, with respect exactly to these issues. Veneto was testing everybody much more massively. Partly was luck that there was a very good microbiologist at the University of Padua, was advising the governor of Veneto. But I fully agree with the whole point that there might be, first, there might be a lot of heterogeneity of preferences, even at the regional level, and also there are a lot of benefits from localism here. I mean, it's not, don't get me wrong. It's not that everything is happening with COVID means that I want a huge, big centralized bureaucracy in charge. Quite the opposite. In fact, we see in the United States, which has a federal government, it has had it for a long time. The federal response was dismal. I mean, and so that doesn't necessarily mean that having a larger centralized government in place is a good thing. Is that there is a lot of potential. I mean, ideally, you would like to have things done in a very broad, coordinated way. Where there are a lot of externalities. There are a lot of potential economies of scale and scope. Certainly, you certainly want things to be done in a very large scale. But at the same time, you want to empower people who have information at the local level. So this is kind of a trade-off. So things have. So here, you know, what is really the European principle of subsidiarity here is what should be followed. So do locally as much as you can, empower the local, even the mayors, the local universities, the local labs, so that they can really know what's going on and have a lot of power at the local level. And then but you step in at levels where they need help, you know, so in terms of financing, in terms of resources, in terms of information, and so on. So, but at the top, when you talk about, you know, mostly, of course, I was talking about the macroeconomic aspects where Europe really is very important. You know, how do you deal with the recession? How do you deal with the depression? How do you deal with the financing, with the debt? Those are macroeconomic issues where, you know, the United States there is in a good shape potentially because there, you know, there is a Federal Reserve, there is a big federal budget, you know, there is the dollar and so on. So that is where Europe needs the economies of scale and scope. But yes, absolutely, the respect of the different cultural aspects as well as you know, ideological aspects and even, you know, more practical aspects at the local level would be key. The last thing that we want is Brussels dictating a common standard for everything, and you know the famous, you know, size of bananas kind of, you know, approach, micromanaging the COVID, you know, and you know, distance between you know, tables in restaurants, you know, uniform across all Europe. I mean, that's the last thing that we need. I mean, this would be the end of Europe if it would be, you know, the regulations of you know, the COVID stuff. You know, no, that's not. But you know, it's the recovery fund that has to be done at the European level, not the size of, you know, not the kind of mask that you should wear. You know, that would be my, you know, my response. Yeah.
That is excellent, Dan. Enrico, thank you very much, Dan. I think we overrun about 5 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. This was,
no,
you know, thank you for the comments. The questions were great, and you know, it was, and thank you again for giving me this opportunity to do this as a way, I hope, in a very minor and imperfect way, to honor a little bit, you know, the memory, the teaching of Alberto Resina. I really miss the fact that it is not here. I'm sure he would have asked some very pointed and interesting and cutting questions right now.
That's excellent. No, thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
folks.
Enrico.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next week in another one of these comparative economics webinars. Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.